Hello, this is Dr. Joe Muscolino. The following is an AI-generated simulated podcast of the contents of my ebook. I've created this and providing this because I believe that it is a very casual way and a comfortable way of listening to and absorbing the information. I hope you do enjoy it.
For us runners, there are a few things worse than suddenly having hamstring issues.
Yeah.
Like, I remember one time I was about to go for a run, and I bent down to tie my shoe right,
Right.
and my hamstring, it just went. And I thought, well, there goes that run.
It's amazing how much pain can come from such a simple movement.
I know, it's crazy.
But that's the thing about hamstrings. They're so important for running, and they're more complicated than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, they really are. It's not just one giant muscle back there.
No, not at all. In each leg, there are actually 3 separate muscles that come together to form the hamstring. The semitendinosus, the semimembranosus, and the biceps femoris. And they each have their own important job to do.
Wow, 3 muscles. See, I'm learning already. So tell me, how do these 3 muscles work together when we're running?
Okay, well, imagine them kind of like a really complicated system of ropes and pulleys. And this system is what controls the movement of your leg. So when you take a stride and your foot pushes off the ground, the hamstrings extend your hip, but then they also work to flex your knee and rotate your leg. So they're really involved in every part of your stride, which means they're always active.
Wow, so they really are working overtime with every single step we take.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that, hamstring injuries are so common for runners. But why are they even more vulnerable than our quadriceps? I mean, those are our real powerhouse muscles, right?
Well, you've hit on a really interesting point. The quadriceps are definitely bigger and stronger, but the research shows very clearly that hamstring strains happen more often.
Wow, now that's surprising. I would not have guessed that. Why is that?
It comes down to a few things. First, like we said before, those 3 hamstring muscles are constantly working while we're running, lengthening, contracting, just controlling all that movement. They don't really get much of a break.
Right.
And second, the way they're structured makes them naturally a little more vulnerable to certain kinds of strains, especially when they're tired or we've stretched them too far.
So they're kind of like the unsung heroes of our stride, working constantly behind the scenes, but also dealing with the brunt of the forces involved.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so let's get into why these so important muscles are so susceptible to getting injured. I'm ready to unpack what actually leads to a hamstring strain. Okay, so I've got to say, having a hamstring strain, the pain from that, it's just different. It's not like when you're just sore after a good workout. It can be really, really bad. So what is it about that injury that causes so much pain?
Yeah, you're right. It can be pretty intense. Remember we were talking about all those nerve fibers. Well, when those muscle fibers tear, those nerves send a signal to your brain telling it that something is wrong. And we usually feel that as this sharp, sudden pain.
Oh, yeah.
It's just your body's way of saying, hey, you need to pay attention to this so it can heal.
And I definitely pay attention when it hits like that. But what actually causes those tears to happen in the first place? We talked about overstretching, but is there more to it?
There are really 2 main things that cause it. And they both have to do with how much we ask of our hamstrings when we run. And you're right, overstretching is definitely a big one.
Right.
So think about when you're running and your leg reaches out in front of you in that stride, that puts a lot of strain on those hamstring muscles. It's stretching them out. And if they're not warmed up enough or flexible enough to handle that, some of those muscle fibers can tear. It's kind of like if you take a rubber band and you keep stretching it, eventually it's going to snap.
Right. That makes sense, especially if you're talking about something like overstriding, where people are extending their leg more than usual with each stride.
Exactly. Overstriding is like a classic example of how, over time, if you keep overstretching those muscles, it can cause problems. But it's not just about reaching the leg out too far. It's also about those powerful contractions. When your toes push off the ground, that's the hamstring muscles contracting, working hard to propel you forward.
So it's a combination of stretching and contracting that can lead to problems.
Yeah, exactly. And just like with overstretching, if your hamstrings aren't ready for that much force, maybe they're tired from a long run or you haven't warmed up properly, that force can be too much. And then you get those tiny tears in the muscle fiber.
It's like they've got this impossible job constantly stretching and contracting and absorbing impact. It's no wonder they get injured so easily.
Yeah, it's a lot to ask of them.
All right, so we've gone through the anatomy of the hamstring, and we've talked about the mechanics of how those strains actually occur. Now, the big question is, how can we prevent these injuries from happening in the first place? I mean, nobody wants to be sidelined with a hamstring injury.
Well, you're absolutely right. Prevention is key here. And the good news is that there's a lot we can do. Dr. Muscolino's manual has a ton of great information on this, and it all starts with a proper warm-up.
I like the sound of that. And I'll admit, sometimes I don't warm up as thoroughly as I should. But it sounds like we're talking about more than just getting the blood flowing right.
You got it. A cold muscle, it's kind of like a stiff piece of taffy. If you try to bend it too far, it's just going to snap. But if you warm that taffy up, it bends and stretches really easily. Warming up does the same thing for our muscles. It makes them more pliable, less likely to tear, and it also increases blood flow, bringing in all that good oxygen and those nutrients.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So warm up, check. What else should we be thinking about?
Flexibility is also super important. We talked about how those long strides stretch out the hamstrings, so having the flexibility to handle that is really key. And it's not enough to just touch your toes. We need to really target that hamstring flexibility specifically.
Oh, I know what you mean. I've definitely been guilty of thinking I was flexible because I could reach my toes, but my hamstrings felt like they were about to explode. So how do we make sure we're stretching those hamstrings effectively?
Well, Dr. Muscolino highlights an exercise called straight leg swings. Basically, you just swing one leg forward and backward, keeping that leg straight, and you want to gradually increase your range of motion. And that is great for both warming up the entire muscle and improving your flexibility.
Straight leg swings. I'm writing that down. I'm definitely going to start adding that to my routine. But you mentioned muscle imbalances before. How do those play into all of this?
Think of your muscles like two teams working together. You've got your quads, which are like the powerhouse for extending your leg, and then the hamstrings control that movement and bring your leg back. So if one of those teams is way stronger than the other, like if your quads are much stronger than your hamstrings, it's like an uneven tug of war, and eventually something's got to give. And usually that's the hamstrings, which just increases your risk of a strain.
So it's just as important to build up those hamstring muscles as it is to work those quads.
Exactly. And it's also crucial to be aware of fatigue. Tired muscles are way more susceptible to injury.
Right.
So it's really important to make sure you're giving your body enough rest and recovery time. Other things to watch out for are previous hamstring injuries. Even poor posture can up your risk.
It really is amazing how everything in the body is connected to everything else. So to prevent these injuries, we need to make sure we're warming up properly, working on our flexibility, and building balanced strength in our muscles. But what if, even with all of that, we still strain our hamstring? What are our options then?
So if you do find yourself with a hamstring strain, the first thing is the right CE protocol: rest, ice, compression, elevation.
Of course.
But that's always going to be your first line of defense to bring down that inflammation. But beyond that initial phase, manual therapy can be really, really effective.
Manual therapy, what does that involve?
Manual therapy is basically hands-on techniques applied directly to your muscles and joints. Things like soft tissue manipulation, for example, cross-fiber massage, can really help to break down scar tissue and improve flexibility. Kind of like a deep tissue massage, but much more targeted.
So it's definitely more than just passive stretching after that initial injury.
Exactly. Targeted stretching, where you stabilize the pelvis to isolate the hamstring, is going to be much more beneficial. And then depending on how bad the strain is, you might also need joint mobilization. This helps to address any stiffness or restrictions in the hip joint, which, very often go hand in hand with hamstring injuries.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. It's so clear that having even just a basic understanding of how our bodies work can make a huge difference in preventing and treating these common running injuries.
I totally agree, and it's amazing how interconnected everything is. And you know what? This whole conversation about muscle imbalances got me thinking, if these imbalances can lead to hamstring strains, what other subtle imbalances might we have that could be holding us back in other ways? Something to think about.
That is something to think about. And on that note, that wraps up our deep dive on hamstring strains. As always, thanks to everyone for listening.
This is Dr. Joe Muscolino again. You've just listened to the AI-generated simulated podcast of the contents located within the ebook. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast and you found it informational. Thank you.